months are a trying time, especially for vulnerable populations who do not have access to air conditioning, groups including the elderly, disabled people, and those renting on low incomes. And for more on this, I am joined by Tracy Heffernan. She is a lawyer at the Advocacy Centre for Kids Ontario, and she's with me here in our Toronto studio. Hello, Tracy.
Hi.
How does extreme heat impact groups like low-income tenants?
Well, it's exactly what Jeff Edwards was describing with regard to the low-income population in Canada. The people most impacted by heat are those who are elderly, they're small children, they're people who have compromised health. Those impacts lead to heat-related illness and also to mortality. And what we also know about those populations is that they tend to be low-income populations in Canada who do not have access to air conditioning, and nor do they have the funds to provide it on their own. The other thing to keep in mind is that if we take Toronto as an example, where those people live tends to be an aging housing stock, what has been termed vertical poverty. And in that aging housing stock, there's very limited access to air conditioning. But also, because they're poor quality buildings, there's limited ventilation, there's certainly no cross draft, and as you go higher up in the building, the hotter it gets.
What do you think needs to be done to address this issue?
Well, some people would, I realize that some people would frame it as that air conditioning is a human right, but I think I would make that broader, and I would say really what we need to be looking at is the right to adequate housing in Canada. That's something that we have signed many international covenants saying that that is something that we will provide to our populace, and we have failed deeply. However, we are in the midst of, the federal government is about to craft a national housing strategy. And in that national housing strategy, it's not so much a focus on access to air conditioning. We wouldn't even question the access to heat in Canada.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because there are a variety of regulations across Canada on minimum temperatures for renters in the winter months. And what rights do tenants have right now when it comes to keeping their homes cool?
Well, they have no rights. They have no rights. So if most people don't realize that we actually have very limited social housing stock in Canada. It's about 5%. So that means 95% of tenants are in the private rental market. And in that private rental market, what we find are high rent, low incomes, and often very poor quality housing. So if you have the money, and it's not prohibited in your lease in Ontario, you could put in a window unit. However, it has to be professionally installed. So you can imagine that for someone who's low income, that can be prohibited.
I want to pick up on what you were saying about the poor quality housing and add another voice to this conversation. Lloyd Alter is the design editor at Tree Hugger, which is a sustainability website, and he's also an adjunct professor of sustainable design at Ryerson University School of Interior Design, and he's also with us here in the studio. Hello, Lloyd.
Hello.
How would you describe, first of all, our cultural relationship with air conditioning?
Well, fundamentally, air conditioning really was not part of our culture at all until post-World War II. Before then, it didn't really exist, so people had natural ways of keeping cool. They would design their houses with cross ventilation, they'd use awnings, they would plant trees, and as you were talking earlier, in the really hot days of summer, they'd go to the movies and go to parks and live outside in the hot weather. If you had money, you went up to Muskoka. If you didn't, you went down to the sunny side. That we adapted to the culture rather than using contraptions. But what's happened is it's just gotten hotter and hotter. And air conditioning, once it was developed, is easy. You didn't have to design properly. You could just toss in a box. And we would use electricity to keep cool instead of our culture to keep cool. And this was really problematic because when you toss in a box, you're using electricity, you're moving heat from the inside to the outside, it becomes a feedback loop. We just get hotter and hotter and hotter, and we get used to being cooler and cooler, so that nobody goes out anymore. And our culture has changed, and our housing has changed, and nothing works unless we plug it in.
So are you saying that we've become a culture of wimps?
Yes.
So you don't agree
the overall how we design our buildings, when we're noisy, you can super insulate buildings and size windows properly so that you don't need much air conditioning. You can sip it instead of using the huge quantities we need now.
I suppose, though, it's one thing to design a building to stay cool, but for existing buildings, I mean, what can be done to keep those who live there comfortable, other than the costly step for some people of installing air conditioning?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of our glass boxes are going to have to be retrofitted at some point. They were simply designed, they've got windows that barely open 4 inches because they don't want kids falling out. They've got central air conditioning now, but it's going to get more and more expensive. The building codes have been changed to limit the amount of glass and increase the amount of insulation. There's going to have to be a massive retrofit of our existing structures.
Tracy, you did mention the fact that the federal government is developing a national housing strategy to look at affordable housing. How specifically would you like to see tenant cooling needs addressed in that strategy?
Well, I think as soon as you talk about the right to adequate housing, you're talking about the right to live in housing that is habitable. If people are dying or their health is being compromised, this is not habitable housing. So I don't think they need to address it specifically, but I think if we had that right enshrined, we could address this larger problem. As a stopgap measure, municipalities could enact maximum temperature bylaws. As you mentioned earlier, we have minimum temperature bylaws, but we don't have maximum temperature bylaws. And this would put the onus on landlords. I understand it would be very expensive to retrofit these buildings, but perhaps there should be government incentives to do that when we see the impact that it's having on people's lives.
Lauren, what do you think, and how do you think the national housing strategy should look at design when it comes to hot summer temperatures?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, Lauren, but this is just one factor in so many things we have to look at, both air conditioning, heating, and insulation, and the design of the buildings. You have to think of the whole package, not just the one item of air conditioning. We're in a climate where we want people to live more closely together, which means not wanting all the windows open all the time. We want higher density, so all my things about what we used to do, planting trees in front of your window, they're not relevant in a high-density environment. So we have to think about the whole thing as a package. Winter, summer, spring, and fall. How do we best design our housing to use the least amount of energy and be most comfortable?
And change our relationship with air conditioning?
Yes, and have dinner late at night and go sit in the patio. Yes.
There you go. Nice to talk to you both. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks very much.
That was Tracy Heffernan. She's a lawyer at the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, and Lloyd Alter is the design editor at Treehugger, which is a sustainability website. He's also an adjunct professor of sustainable design at Ryerson University's School of Interior Design, and they were both with me here in studio in Toronto. Well, now we do want to hear from you on this. Do you consider air conditioning a human right? Let us know. Tweet us at The Current CBC, or you can post on the story on our Facebook page, or you can send us an email by clicking on contact at cbc.ca/The Current. You're listening to The Current Review on CBC Radio 1. I'm Robin Bresnahan.
I'd like to cash this check here and then I can take you out for a steak dinner.
It is open.
Been a while since I've done this. How do you want to again?
Dr. Connor to the ER. Dr. Connor to the ER.
This is irrefutable evidence that the defendant is lying.
The larger-than-life character played by Leonardo DiCaprio in Catch Me If You Can. It was based on the real-life character of Frank William Abagnale Jr. He was not a pilot, a doctor, or a lawyer, and that check he was about to cash was as fake as any persona he created. What Frank Abagnale was a con artist, making millions by his 19th birthday, all by convincing people to part with their cash. How con artists pull it off again and again is the subject of a book by New Yorker magazine writer Maria Konnikova. It is called The Confidence Game. Why we fall for it every time. She spoke to Anna Maria from New York City back in January. I have to tell you that I've had dreams